right, so just continuing on here in chapter 33, now looking at some of the specific endocrine glands and the hormones that they produce. All right, now we're going to get into actually some of the different glands and the hormones they make and what those hormones do. So starting with the pituitary gland, it is right underneath the hypothalamus, as we had seen in the picture at the beginning. And this is actually where 9 different hormones get made. So the pituitary makes a lot of different ones. So these ultimately influence other endocrine glands. So again, kind of our command center, hypothalamus is the main command center. Pituitary, though, helps activate a lot of other glands as well. So it has actually 2 lobes. So based on its position, we have the posterior pituitary and we have the anterior pituitary. So posterior is closer to the back, anterior closer to the front. But the posterior regulates water conservation. So again, that antidiuretic hormone, but then also in women involved in lactation and also uterine contraction during pregnancy. The anterior regulates all the other glands. So the anterior is going to be producing most of the hormones of the pituitary. All right, so our hypothalamus and posterior pituitary, again, they're connected by a tract of neurons. So those hormones produced by the cell bodies of the hypothalamus, they actually get transported directly to the posterior and posterior pituitary gland. Again, a couple of the hormones released here. So we already mentioned the antidiuretic hormone. That's also called vasopressin. It's the same one, just has a slightly different name. And again, as we talked earlier about with our example, that helps the kidneys retain water, so it prevents dehydration. Then the other, so besides water balance, then contraction of the uterine, so oxytocin is another hormone that's made. This starts uterine contractions during childbirth, and it also is involved in lactation, so the release of milk following pregnancy. This is also what's given for pregnancy. If somebody's being induced, they're actually given this hormone. This oxytocin hormone is given to them to start and trigger the woman to go into labor. Now the anterior pituitary, again, produces a lot more. So if you can remember oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone being in the posterior, then all the other pituitary ones are in the anterior. So that'll help you a little bit. So some of the ones produced here, so thyroid stimulating hormone. So as the name implies, that hormone activates the thyroid gland, and then the thyroid gland produces a hormone called thyroxine, and that's involved in oxidative respiration. So ATP, energy, metabolism is what's happening there. We also have ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. That's going to stimulate the adrenal glands. Again, those are on top of the kidneys to make specific hormones. It also produces growth hormone, which the name implies. This is going to increase muscle and bone throughout the body to allow for growth. A few of other, so follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. So this is in females. It triggers the maturation of an egg and stimulates the release of estrogen. It also works in males as well in the reproductive organs. So in males, it regulates sperm development. And then luteinizing hormone, or LH, so in females, again, triggers ovulation of a mature egg. In males, it stimulates the production of testosterone. So again, in this case, both of these hormones are working on the reproductive system. They have slightly different effects in males or females, but ultimately they're leading or helping to control reproduction. And then we also have prolactin, which stimulates, again, the production of milk, or again, lactation. So we have oxytocin, but we also have prolactin. And then MSH, or melanocyte stimulating hormone. So this is only in reptiles and amphibians, and this is actually what causes them to change their color. So those chameleons that can go to different colors, it's due to this hormone. So it is found in humans, but the function is poorly understood. Of course, we're not changing color, so exactly what it's doing, not quite sure. All right, so again, just kind of a summary here looking at these two. So anything like this that helps you remember, there are some tables at the end that I'll mention, but just kind of coming up either with mnemonics or note cards, some diagrams or flow charts, just whatever may help you to remember which glands are producing the hormone and then what that hormone does. So again, the hypothalamus up here activating directly on the pituitary, the posterior pituitary just making the ADH and oxytocin, the anterior though producing several others, so the prolactin, the FSH and LH that alter our gonads, the testes or the ovaries, growth hormone, that ACTH or the TSH. So again, any of these figures or anything that just helps you kind of keep these straight will be important for you for studying. All right, now a lot of times the release of hormones is based on what's referred to as feedback or negative feedback. Okay, so again, the brain is telling these glands to release hormones. Well, how long do they actually need to be releasing them? So there's this negative feedback that gets used. So for example, so whenever the hypothalamus is telling the anterior pituitary to do something, well, how long does it keep doing it? Okay, so what happens is when there's enough of the target hormone has been made, that hormone itself actually goes back to the hypothalamus and that anterior pituitary, and it inhibits the release of more stimulating hormones. All right, so for example, if we just look at the normal pathway, so again, the hypothalamus being our command center, it causes the release of hormones from the that then activate the anterior pituitary. That anterior pituitary releases its hormones. They go to the target cell to actually do their job. All right, so then those are going to be releasing hormones. Okay, so for example, if the antidiuretic hormone, goes and does something, or follicle stimulating goes and does something, okay, once enough of that has occurred, what's going to happen is that target gland, like the thyroid or the ovaries or the adrenal cortex, they also release hormones. And what those hormones do is, of course, they go and do their job. But if we have a lot of them, those hormones themselves go back and inhibit the hypothalamus. So they're like, okay, we have enough, stop activating the anterior pituitary. Or some of them may actually go back to the anterior pituitary and then stop the production of more hormones from it. But in either situation, again, the buildup of hormones kind of at the end, whatever the end goal was, once we have enough of that activation of the cell, the hormone also goes back and tells the hypothalamus or anterior pituitary, hey, we're good, we need to stop production of more hormones. And that's referred to as negative feedback. All right, now moving on to a few other glands and hormones. So the pancreas, this is both exocrine and endocrine, meaning that it produces molecules, it secretes molecules, which is exocrine. So for example, it secretes digestive enzymes that are used in the small intestine to help break down like proteins and lipids, but it does also produce hormones. So exocrine would be the enzymes that are released, and of course endocrine would be the hormones that it gets released. So it does a couple different things. Focusing here on the hormones, they're produced by the islets of Langerhans, and they produce two main ones, insulin and glucagon. Insulin, they both regulate glucose. Insulin promotes the uptake of glucose. So whenever the blood sugar levels are high, insulin gets released. It tells cells to suck up the glucose from the blood and store it. We store glucose in animals as glycogen in the liver, and if we have more than that that's needed, then we store any extra as triglycerides in our fat. So again, if we've just eaten, we have lots of sugar in the blood, insulin gets released, tells the body to suck up glucose and store it. Now, if it's been a little bit since we've eaten, now our blood sugar has dropped. Now we need to release that glucose. So that's the job of glucagon. So it's released by the pancreas. It goes to liver cells to release that glycogen, either by releasing the glycogen or breaking down triglycerides. So insulin decreases blood sugar, glucagon increases it. All right, now this is just showing again. So again, right after a meal, our blood glucose is really high. So the pancreas is going to increase insulin secretion, decrease glucagon secretion. So ultimately, cells are taking up the glucose and decreasing it from the blood. Then in between meals, now our blood sugar drops. So now the pancreas is going to decrease insulin and increase glucagon. And now glucagon is going to break down our fat, break down the glycogen, and release glucose into the blood to return it to normal. All right, so whenever we talk about the pancreas, we also talk a good bit about diabetes. So diabetes is, of course, a serious disorder that's mainly involved in not being able to control their blood glucose. It's actually the 7th leading cause of death in the US, and there are 2 different types. Type 1 is a heritable disease. It's actually autoimmune, where antibodies are made that attack those islets of Langerhans, and they prevent or significantly decrease the insulin secretion. So for those individuals, they can't even make insulin. So they are on an insulin pump where insulin is provided to them 24 hours a day through this little pump. Typically that is also called juvenile because it's seen early on, because again, it's an autoimmune. It doesn't wait till later. It happens early during an adolescence typically. Whereas type 2, now this isn't so much that insulin isn't being made, it's that cells don't respond. So it's called insulin insensitivity. So they're no longer sensitive or responding to insulin. So this is due to a reduction in insulin receptors. So now it's not that enough insulin isn't being made, it's that so much has been made for a long period of time, cells are just kind of becoming tolerant to it. So it decreases receptor production, which then alters the ability to control glucose. All right, now taking a look at the thyroid, parathyroid, and adrenal glands, starting first with the thyroid. So it makes several hormones as well. One of the main ones is thyroxine. This is really important for our metabolic rate, so maintaining our energy levels and promoting growth. Interesting thing about thyroxine is it contains iodine. And what happens is if the amount of iodine is too low in our diet, then the thyroid can't make enough thyroxine that inhibits the hypothalamus. And then as a result of that, the hypothalamus stimulates the thyroid to get bigger, thinking there's something wrong with it. You're not making enough thyroxine. Let's make you bigger so you make more. Again, the issue isn't with not having thyroxine. It's not having the iodine to help it. Ultimately, though, what happens whenever the thyroid gets bigger is it produces what's called a goiter on the side of the neck, again, due to that lack of iodine. Another hormone that gets released is calcitonin, and calcitonin actually inhibits the release of calcium from bones and promotes its uptake. So it's absorbing all the calcium and storing it inside of the bones and removing it from the blood or anywhere else. So it's helping to suck up or store that calcium. Now, the parathyroid is actually made up of 4 small glands that are attached to the thyroid. They make what is called parathyroid hormone, and that is one of the hormones absolutely essential for survival. So some of these, if they're not produced in enough, then, like even insulin or glucagon, again, we can kind of overcome them. The body compensates. However, parathyroid hormone is essential. If we don't make it, we don't survive. The reason it's so important is because it regulates our calcium levels. And those calcium ions are required for muscle contraction. And of course, the heart is one of our main muscles we need to stay alive. So if we don't have calcium regulation, we don't have muscle contraction and we die. So it is absolutely essential for survival. So again, that thyroid or that parathyroid hormone stimulates the release of calcium from the bone, which is the opposite of what we just talked about. So calcitonin that we just talked about in the thyroid, it has the opposite. It stores the calcium in the bone. Parathyroid releases the calcium from the bone. All right, and this is just a nice little visual to look at this. So if our calcium levels are low, then we're going to stimulate the parathyroid hormone, and that is going to increase the calcium in the blood. Now, if we have high calcium, so there's a lot of calcium in the blood here, then calcitonin gets stimulated by the thyroid, and that's going to cause the calcium to be absorbed and stored in the bone. So again, kind of similar to glucagon and insulin that have opposite effects. Parathyroid hormone and calcitonin have opposite effects with calcium. All right, now moving on to our adrenal gland. The adrenal glands are located again right there above the kidneys. They have two parts. The medulla is on the inner part. This is where epinephrine and norepinephrine, which are kind of our fight or flight activations, so our speed, for example. And then it also has the cortex, which is the outer region, and it produces steroid hormones, cortisol and aldosterone. All right, now these hormones here, so they're in the adrenal medulla. Again, our adrenaline or epinephrine or norepinephrine, this is released in times of stress. So they act as those emergency signals. So again, that fight or flight, we're running from a bear kind of thing. So it's stimulating body fuel to get us out of a situation. Now the adrenal cortex, where those hormones are made, cortisol, this is one that's helps to maintain nutritional well-being. So it's also released in a time of stress, but it can be a chronic problem if stress continues. This also typically is indicated with storing more fat around the midsection. Again, this is where the kidneys are and the adrenal gland is. And the release of this cortisol can kind of help store up fat. So too much of it due to stress kind of increases fat storage in that midsection. Now, aldosterone is one of the other ones, steroid hormones there in the adrenal cortex. This affects water reabsorption of the kidneys, and it also affects blood volume and blood pressure. So whether or not the kidneys are releasing water or not releasing it is controlled here by our aldosterone. All right, so the last couple slides, I'm mainly just pointing out that, again, I think these are good study tools to help whether you come up with a flow chart. Again, you use these kind of tables and kind of cover them up as you study, just actively going through, because these have the different glands. So the adrenal cortex, it shows the hormones that are produced, so aldosterone and cortisol, and then over here it talks about their action. So it's, maintaining water absorption by controlling potassium and sodium ions. Cortisol, again, times of stress, mobilizes fat, kind of our nutritional well-being. The adrenal medulla, epinephrine, norepinephrine. Okay, then we have our hypothalamus, and then all the different hormones that are made by it and what they do. So again, these are just nice little summary tables I think that are beneficial for you studying. The next one here, again, looking at the ovaries, produces estrogen and progesterone. Pancreas makes insulin and glucagon. So again, I just think each of these little tables are nice to summarize what the hormones are, which gland is producing them, and then what that hormone ultimately does. So again, just nice little study tools to help with that.